Yul Brynner sat perfectly still in Alfred Hitchcock's office at Paramount Studios and listened to the master of suspense explain why actors were nothing more than sophisticated puppets, knowing that the next 10 minutes would determine whether Hollywood's most controlling director had finally met someone who refused to be controlled. Spring 1958, stage 18, 4:30 in the afternoon, and the 38-year-old force of nature was about to teach the 59-year-old cinematic genius that some people learn to hold their own strings long before they ever stepped in front of a camera. If you're fascinated by untold stories of Yul Brynner's legendary encounters with Hollywood's most powerful directors, subscribe to Yul Brynner Untold Legacy for more hidden moments where unstoppable charisma met immovable authority. Hitchcock sat behind his imposing desk like a general planning a military campaign, his precisely tailored suit and methodical manner radiating the kind of absolute control that had made him one of cinema's most successful directors. At 59, he had perfected a system of filmmaking that left nothing to chance, nothing to improvisation, nothing to the unpredictable whims of actors who might confuse their own ideas with professional necessity. "Mr. Brynner," Hitchcock said, his distinctively measured voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I want to be absolutely clear about how I work so there are no misunderstandings later." He gestured toward the elaborate storyboards that covered one wall of his office, hundreds of precisely drawn frames that mapped out every shot, every angle, every movement that would appear in his next film. "Actors, in my experience, are fundamentally tools," Hitchcock continued, his tone suggesting he was explaining a mathematical principle rather than discussing human beings. Sophisticated tools, certainly, talented tools, undoubtedly, but tools nonetheless, existing to serve the vision rather than to impose their own interpretations upon it. Yul listened without expression, his dark eyes taking in not just Hitchcock's words but his body language, his assumptions, his absolute certainty that the dynamic between them had already been established. "You see," Hitchcock said, warming to his theme, "the camera sees everything, the lighting reveals everything, the editing controls everything. Actors are simply elements within that system, important elements, but elements nonetheless. They exist only as much as light and lens allow them to exist." He leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes studying Yul with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a piece of equipment for its potential utility. "In my films, you will go where I tell you to go, stand where I tell you to stand, move when I tell you to move. Your job is not to think or feel or interpret. Your job is to be precisely what the story requires, nothing more and nothing less." The silence that followed was profound. Most actors, when faced with Hitchcock's systematic reduction of their craft to mechanical function, either accepted the diminished role or argued futilely against an immovable philosophy. But Yul did neither. Instead, he shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. Not dramatically, not obviously, but with the kind of minimal movement that somehow altered the entire energy of the room. Suddenly, despite Hitchcock's commanding position behind his massive desk, despite his decades of authority, despite his legendary status, the balance of power in the office had shifted. "Mr. Hitchcock," Yul said quietly, his accented voice carrying easily across the space between them, "your reputation as a master of cinematic technique is well-deserved. Your control over every element of production is legendary. Your success speaks for itself." Hitchcock nodded, accepting what seemed like acknowledgement of his superiority. "However," Yul continued, and that single word changed everything, "I learned something in the circus that might interest you." He stood slowly, his movement carrying the kind of controlled grace that suggested depths of physical discipline that desk-bound authority could never command. When he reached his full height, somehow the dimensions of Hitchcock's office seemed different, smaller, less imposing, dominated by presence rather than position. "When you're working on a trapeze 20 meters above the ground with no net," Yul said, walking closer to Hitchcock's desk, "you cannot be anyone's puppet. If someone else is pulling your strings, if someone else is making your decisions, if someone else is controlling your movements, you fall." His dark eyes fixed on Hitchcock's with an intensity that cut through the director's comfortable assumptions about power and control. "In the circus, I learned to hold my own strings, not from arrogance, not from rebelliousness, but from necessity, because the alternative to self-control was death. The atmosphere in the office had changed completely. Hitchcock, accustomed to actors who either cowered before his authority or blustered ineffectively against it, found himself facing something he had rarely encountered. Someone whose presence commanded attention not through position or reputation, but through sheer force of character. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Hitchcock asked, his voice carrying a slight edge that suggested his comfort level was beginning to erode. "I'm suggesting that some of us bring more to your camera than mere mechanical function," Yul replied, moving even closer to the desk. "Some of us bring experience that informs every movement, training that shapes every gesture, understanding that deepens every moment." Without any apparent effort, Yul placed his hands on Hitchcock's desk and leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the kind of quiet authority that made it clear who was controlling the conversation. "You want your actors to go where you tell them, stand where you tell them, move when you tell them, but what if an actor could anticipate where you wanted them to go? What if they could find the precise position that serves your vision better than your conscious direction? What if they could move with timing that enhances your rhythm rather than merely following it?" The questions hung in the air, like a challenge to everything Hitchcock believed about the relationship between directors and actors. "That sounds suspiciously like improvisation," Hitchcock said, his tone suggesting he had just mentioned something distasteful. "I don't believe in improvisation. I believe in precision." "So do I," Yul replied immediately, "but precision born from understanding rather than obedience. Precision that comes from discipline rather than direction. Precision that serves story because it serves truth." He straightened slowly, his movement carrying the same controlled grace that had marked every action since he entered the office. "You said actors are puppets in your films, Mr. Hitchcock, that they exist only as much as light and lens allow them to exist." Yul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow carried more authority than any shout. "But remember this: puppets are only as alive as the imagination of those who manipulate them. I learned to create my own life in circus sawdust, with my own blood, my own risk, my own commitment to something larger than survival." The silence that followed was electric. Hitchcock sat frozen behind his desk, his comfortable assumptions about directorial authority suddenly challenged by someone who operated from a completely different understanding of power and control. "What are you proposing?" Hitchcock asked finally. "Collaboration," Yul replied simply. "Your technical mastery combined with experience that brings depth to every frame. Your control of the medium enhanced by understanding of the message. Your precision supported by preparation that goes deeper than mere memorization." He moved toward the door, then turned back to face Hitchcock with something that might have been respect. "You are a master of your craft, Mr. Hitchcock. Your films demonstrate genius that lesser directors can only envy. But consider this. What if your next film featured not just sophisticated puppets, but partners who could elevate your vision beyond what direction alone could achieve?" The question lingered in the air as Yul reached for the door handle. "I'll give you time to think about it," he said quietly, "but understand that some strings cannot be pulled by others because they're woven into the fabric of who we are. And sometimes, the most powerful performance comes not from being controlled, but from choosing to serve something worthy of our best effort." With that, he left, closing the door behind him with a kind of quiet finality that suggested the conversation was over, but its implications would resonate for quite some time. Alfred Hitchcock sat alone in his office for several minutes after Yul's departure, staring at the storyboards that had suddenly seemed less like comprehensive planning and more like limitations on possibilities he hadn't considered. For the first time in decades, the master of control found himself wondering whether absolute directorial authority was the same thing as optimal artistic achievement. Years later, Hitchcock would describe that meeting as one of the most challenging encounters of his career. In a 1968 interview, he said, I had become accustomed to actors who either submitted to direction or fought against it. But Yul Brynner offered something I hadn't expected: the possibility of partnership without surrender of vision. The interviewer asked what had changed his perspective on working with strong-willed actors. "Understanding that strength of will could serve the film rather than threaten the director," Hitchcock replied. "Most actors who resist direction do so from ego or insecurity. But some resist from confidence. Confidence that they can contribute something valuable if allowed to participate rather than merely execute." A Paramount executive who witnessed parts of the meeting was interviewed for the same article. "I'd seen dozens of actors come and go from Hitchcock's office over the years," he said. "Most left either intimidated or frustrated. But that day I watched something unprecedented. I watched Alfred Hitchcock reconsider assumptions he'd held for his entire career." The executive paused thoughtfully. It wasn't that Brynner challenged Hitchcock's authority. It was that he offered an alternative to the traditional power dynamic, one where both director and actor could operate from strength rather than one dominating the other. Although the specific project that prompted their meeting never materialized, colleagues noted that Hitchcock's approach to working with certain actors evolved significantly in his later films, showing greater willingness to incorporate actor insights into his meticulous planning process. Yul Brynner never spoke publicly about the encounter, but a note found among his papers read, "Met with a cinematic genius today who had confused control with collaboration. His technical mastery is undeniable, his artistic vision extraordinary. But he had forgotten that the most powerful performances come from artists who choose to serve the story rather than being forced to serve the director. Sometimes the strongest control comes from knowing when not to control." This story reminds us that true authority often lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the confidence to engage with them as equals. Hitchcock's legendary control over every aspect of filmmaking had served him brilliantly throughout his career, but it had also created limitations on the kinds of performances he could elicit from actors. Yul Brynner's challenge wasn't about undermining directorial authority. It was about expanding the definition of what that authority could accomplish when paired with actors who brought their own disciplined preparation to the collaboration. The encounter revealed something important about the difference between compliance and commitment, between following direction and serving vision, between being controlled and choosing to participate in something larger than individual ego. In any creative endeavor, the tension between control and collaboration creates either limitation or expansion, depending on how it's managed. Hitchcock's system had achieved remarkable results through precise control, but Yul's proposal suggested that even greater results might be possible through precise collaboration. The lesson extends beyond filmmaking to any situation where leadership must balance control with empowerment, direction with inspiration, authority with partnership. The strongest leaders often discover that their greatest achievements come not from their ability to control others, but from their wisdom in recognizing when to share creative ownership with those capable of elevating the entire endeavor. If this story of creative authority meeting creative independence resonated with you, Yul Brynner Untold Legacy preserves exactly these moments where Yul Brynner's unique understanding of artistic collaboration challenged Hollywood's traditional power structures. His ability to respect genius while refusing to surrender his own creative authority, his understanding that true service to story required strength rather than submission, and his skill at transforming potential conflict into creative opportunity revealed the wisdom that made him more than just a movie star. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to discover more stories where different forms of mastery created friction that ultimately generated light, where established authority met confident independence, and where the greatest artists of their generation learned that power shared intelligently often proves more effective than power hoarded selfishly. Because some lessons about leadership, collaboration, and the creative process can only be learned from those who've refused to accept limitations on what partnership between strong individuals can accomplish.